Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the political segment. The song you heard just now was Themata from Carnival. Very beautiful song, very intricate song. And it really shows it's your culture that's being suppressed. Now we have our guest, the General Secretary of the Zimbabwe Communist Party, Ngqabutho Mabhena. Welcome, Ngqabutho.
Thank you for having me.
Yes. Now, I'd just like to have like a few questions. Just first about you, like, how did you end up becoming the General Secretary of the Zimbabwe Communist Party? I know that you had grown up actually in the National Liberation Movement of ZAPU, but then you took a more radical turn. So what went on with that transition?
Well, I was born in a ZAPU family during the liberation struggle. I was very young, but we did interact because I grew up in a village. We were engaged in a bush war. So my grandmother and my uncle, we used to go to these meetings, night meetings, to give food to ZANLA forces. The ZIPRA forces would also visit our area and would prepare food for them. So it was at that early age that we became conscious of the struggle. We began to understand why there was a war. The main reason being that we were in a village where all of us, we were kind of squat in one village. Our cattle will graze in a mountainous area, but on the other part, there was a white man who owned a huge farm, and our cattle were not allowed to go then. So we always asked when we were young boys, head boys, to ask why were our cattle not allowed. We were told that it was a farm owned by white men and black people could not graze their cattle then. So that's why we became conscious and supported the liberation struggle. But of course, after independence, ZANU-PF won, led by Mugabe, we were disappointed because the entire village where I grew up were ZAPU supporters. We would have loved ZAPU to win, but it did not win. So my political consciousness started there. But of course, later on, in the trade union movement, of course, I joined the movement for democratic change in 1999. I was part of the people that participated in its formation. Firstly, we did the consultation. The consultation was based on establishing a mass working class movement that was going to challenge for state power. And we went to the National Working People's Convention in 1999, where we laid the basis for the formation of the movement for democratic change. But unfortunately, it was then hijacked. So I joined the MDC coming from the leftist tradition, as it were.
Okay. So you were hoping for the MDC to have a left orientation, but it went right.
We were hoping that it was going to have a left orientation because the basis for forming the movement for democratic change was to challenge the neoliberal agenda as introduced in 1991, the economic structure adjustment program. And you also would know that in 1981, ZANU-PF assisted in establishing the Zimbabwe Congress of Trade Union. When we gained our independence in 1980, workers went on strike demanding better working conditions. So as a way of cooling them off, so to speak, ZANU-PF had to mobilize them to say, establish a labor union, a federation, which was then Zimbabwe Congress of Trade Union. And the brother of Robert Mugabe was Prime Minister then. Albert Mugabe became the first Secretary General of the Zimbabwe Congress of Trade Unions. But when the Economic Structure Adjustment Program, ESAP, was introduced in 1991, ZCTU began to break away from ZANU-PF along ideological lines. So it was at that point that progressive civil society trade unions then began to usher in a new political direction, leading firstly to the convening or the establishment of the National Constituent Assembly, NCA, in June 1997 to advocate for a people-driven constitution in Zimbabwe, because the constitution that we had was written for us in the Lancaster House. We called it a ceasefire document. And then in 1999, we then had the National Working People's Convention, and then the MDC was launched in September 1999. And of course, later on, it got hijacked. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So going back to what you were discussing about the structural adjustment program, I've noticed that what the arguments you had made and the arguments that the party makes is that what really set Zimbabwe's economy towards a downward spiral was not the taking of land, but it was the structural adjustment program that they agreed to about 8 years earlier in 1992. Is that correct?
You are quite correct, because we need to go back a bit. In 1965, on the 11th of November, Ian Douglas Smith had unilaterally declared independence from Britain. So Rhodesia was no longer known as a colony of the British. Sanctions were then imposed by the British to try and force Ian Smith. They adopted what was called national planning, and they built a strong economy. This, of course, they borrowed from the British. You'll remember when Britain was involved in the Second World War, they to place a number of companies under state control for them to be effective in fighting the Second World War. So Smith followed that program for 15 years, that is up to 1980. When we got majority rule in 1980, we inherited national planning from the Smith regime for the next 10 years. But of course, we ran into trouble because the debt kept on accumulating. And the advice which was given when Bernard Zero, an economist, a liberal economist who apparently during the war was working in the United States, then gave advice that the only way out was to adopt the economic structural adjustment program. So this is where we trace in the main the collapse of the Zimbabwean economy. But the issue of the land invasion or land reform in 2000, it came a bit later, and also because it was then used by ZANU-PF for political survival. You will know that the agreement in Lancaster House was a willing buyer, willing seller for 10 years. In 1990, it expired, or but the state did not follow through in terms of land reform, even though it passed a Land Act in 1992 for the state to have access to land. But again, you needed to compensate. If you were to take land, you needed to compensate farmers. The state did not have that kind of money to compensate. So we ran into problems. Then in 1998, there was a land donor conference in Harare, where in 1997, the Labour Party had come into power. It refused then to continue funding the land program in Zimbabwe. So when then we as ZANU-PF lost the constitutional referendum in 2000, it then supported the program by the war veterans and villagers who then went to occupy land.
Okay. So that's what went into it. So the land seizure was actually just a survival tactic in your mind by the ZANU-PF after failing to get that vote, I guess. It was
certainly.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so I just would like to ask, so the ZANU-PF is always kind of smeared as a party that went too far in their implementation of socialism. But actually, you argue as a Zimbabwe Communist Party that socialism was never implemented. And in fact, I noticed recently there was a call to call the ZANU-PF treasonous because they had surrendered maybe 100% of mining rights to foreign companies. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, ZANU-PF never implemented socialism. Of course, liberals out there, particularly in Zimbabwe, will say that our economic collapse must be traced in the first decade of our independence, because they believe that the program, the national planning, was a socialist program, which was not. It was not a socialist program. Then it adopted the neoliberal agenda in 1991. Then after the formation of the MDC, Mugabe being dumped by his Western friends after he took part in the Congo War in 1998. And of course, in the invasion of land, he got dumped like Ngqabutho of Zaire, who was dumped by his hangers. He then went far left. He became an ultra-leftist and was then seen as a man who was against or anti-imperialist. So he was able to mobilize the progressive world around his rhetoric, anti-imperialist rhetoric. But when it was then removed by the military in 2007, in 2017, Emmerson Mnangagwa then was then trying to end international isolation. It was then that President Emmerson Mnangagwa then said, let's give back land to the former white commercial farmers. Let's open our minds or give our minds to international companies as a way of ending international isolation. So ZANU-PF has never been committed to socialist principles. It has used it as a rhetoric.
Okay. So that kind of leads me to another question about the current numbers. Apparently the government and looks like some independent World Bank numbers that also recorded like very positive numbers. I think it was 2021, where the GDP had grown maybe 8 to 11%. But is there more to those numbers? Is it a GDP that grows with everybody, or is it really just benefiting a few foreign and local elites?
We are talking of a country that over 80% of the workforce is in the informal sector. The buildings, industries, those structures are now used as places of worship. There is no production that is taking place. We are a supermarket of South Africa. Most of the goods that we consume, the food that we consume, comes from South Africa, from Botswana. You have high number of people on daily basis crossing the border post with South Africa to buy in the morning foodstuffs for resale in Zimbabwe. So the gap between the poor and the rich is widening. So what Mthuli Ngqube is talking about, the Minister of Finance, and the numbers by the World Bank does not reflect what is happening on the ground. You know that our hospital collapsed, the clinics, the workers have no access to proper medical health care. We are talking of unions that are in the public sector that have been on strike for the most part of the last 3 years because the government cannot pay what was agreed. In 2016, there was an agreement with civil servants that they were going to be paid $540. And then now, in the last 2 years, they were being paid $105, dropping from the $540 because we still have a problem to resolve the currency problem question in Zimbabwe. A government through the industrial action by workers, mainly in the teaching profession, government now says is paying them $240, which they will start earning this month and in March. And the $240 also includes what is called the COVID allowance that is being given to civil servants. So the numbers that you have referred to do not reflect what is happening on the ground. Infrastructure has basically collapsed.
Oh my goodness, that's a pretty sobering analysis, which kind of goes to, now I know one part of your program is to diversify currency, maybe to transition to maybe also using the South African rand, for example, and not just as legal tender, but as issue by the National Bank. What are the other radical programs that you would suggest in order to actually repair the economy and to make it functional for the Zimbabwean masses and for the African masses in the region, if you have some sort of regional strategy for SADC?
Well, what we have said is that in the immediate, we need to adopt the rand as a currency for exchange in Zimbabwe. You have the working class. Many Zimbabweans are working in South Africa and have access to the rand. Like I've said earlier on, that we buy our products from South Africa. So it makes sense to resolve the currency question as an immediate task. We need to do that. But in the mid and long term, we are talking of building a national democratic economy. This calls for national dialogue amongst ourselves as Zimbabweans, amongst the regional actors, so that we build what we need to do in Zimbabwe is to build a national democratic economy. Without building the national democratic economy, without focusing on production, we cannot rebuild that economy. While we have said that our program is not socialist in principle, we think that at this stage, we can have some kind of accommodation with the capital to say we have minerals in Zimbabwe, we have the best agricultural land, we have a trained workforce. We need at this stage to find a balancing act in building this national democratic economy, because where we are, we cannot transit, assuming the Zimbabwean Communist Party to be part of government, we cannot transit to a socialist economy at the current stage. We need to ensure that our factories are open. We need to get young people into the workplaces. Once they're at the workplaces, we focus on production. We also raise the class consciousness, build our trade union, so that when we transit to the next stage of human development, which is socialism, you have a workforce and a peasantry that clearly understands the socialist program.
Okay. So do you base the ability to implement socialism on just the national productive capacity? Do you base it on Zimbabwe's integration with the SADC economy, the integration of the African economy, any or all of those things? What do you base the ability to implement socialism on?
Well, firstly, in our own conditions, we must first have a functioning economy. Because we argue that without a functioning economy, it will be difficult for us to transit. So this is why we're saying, let us build a national democratic economy based on national planning, linked to devolution of power to the people. That means the people must participate in the rebuilding of the Zimbabwean economy. And of course, our economy is linked to our neighbors in the region and to the rest of the continent. It is then at that point that in the next 15 to 20 years, when we have built a sound economy, when we have prepared the working class, we have prepared the peasants, that we will be able at that point to transit to a socialist Zimbabwe, because to a socialist economy. Because at this stage where we are, where there's no production, where people are in the informal sector, where people are basically, we call it a kia economy, you cannot, in our view, rebuild that economy or transit to a socialist economy. It is important that we build a sound economy in Zimbabwe. And what we should not forget is that there's this perception, as we were discussing earlier on, that national planning was a socialist program, which is, of course, is not correct. So we need to raise the class consciousness for the working people to understand that production is key. We need to reach a stage where we produce goods based on the needs of society, not based on profit.
Oh, yes. Okay. Yeah, because, you could have national planning, but if all of the state-owned companies are profit-oriented or not linked with the people, then it's not necessarily socialist.
Certainly.
That's what you're trying to say. Okay. So I think we'll veer off a little bit from the local Zimbabwean politics to maybe what's going on in Europe because I noticed that you had a recent interview with a Zimbabwean student in Ukraine, and
yes.
You basically talked about maybe the racism that went on. Can you elaborate a little bit on your understanding of what's going on there, what the party's position is, and why you've taken the stand that you've taken?
We are anti-imperialist. We have defined ours as a struggle against imperialism, a struggle against what we call in Zimbabwe the looting class. We are opposed to the expansion by NATO, and it is our view that we must dismantle NATO. It has no business to recruit Ukraine or anyone in Eastern Europe to belong to NATO, for it to continue to build military bases as it has done in Africa and the other parts of the world. When we're checking, the United States has about 800 military bases across the globe. And we are opposed to that. We will recall also what happened in what was known as the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Soviet Union, after an attempt to assassinate Comrade Fidel Castro by the Americans, and Fidel Castro invited the Soviet Union to protect him from a possible future attack from the Americans. And we know what happened, that the United States could not allow the Soviet Union to place its bases, military bases on the Cuban soil, Cuba as a sovereign state. But the United States and her friends, NATO, they want to do the same to Russia by placing their military bases in Ukraine and in other states around Russia. We are opposed to that. So our call as the Zimbabwe Communist Party is that while we respect, like anyone else, the sovereignty of Ukraine, but its sovereignty does not give it a right to invite the United States and the NATO to set up its basic military bases on its soil. That should not happen. So we're opposed to that, and we call on the European government not to join NATO, to respect the agreements that were signed. So this is our position as the Zimbabwe Communist Party. And of course, the interview that you referred to, we also need to understand what is happening with the students who are caught up in the war. And we had a discussion with the one Zimbabwean student. We have been seeing also what has been happening in between Ukraine and at the border with Poland, where Black people are being pushed to the back of the queue. That we condemn. We condemn such racism. It should not be happening in the 21st century.
I mean, that's an excellent point to be making. Excellent understanding of the situation as well. Now, just one final message that you have for the people of Canada in terms of this country's foreign policy, maybe towards Zimbabwe in particular, because I understand Canada does have sanctions on Zimbabwe. And the general message that you want to give to our Canadian and North American audience.
We are opposed to any form of sanctions against anyone. We are opposed to the sanctions that were imposed to the political leadership in Zimbabwe. We are opposed to the sanctions that are imposed to anyone, be it Venezuela, the economic embargo in Cuba, and across the globe, even the sanctions that have been imposed to the government of Russia and the people of Russia. We are opposed to that. So we are opposed to any form of sanctions. And we want all of us to build a peaceful society. We do not want war. NATO should not expand. It should actually be dismantled. For us to build a peaceful society, the first step is to dismantle NATO. We saw what happened in Libya. We have seen what NATO does across the globe. So NATO must be dismantled for us to have peace. And of course, with young people in Canada, it is our wish that we continue to engage and build a strong leftist global movement.
Excellent message. Now we're gonna close the song with the song that Ngqabutho picked. What's the song?
Well, it's a song by Peter Tosh. Speaks about fighting apartheid. So, we were being engaged in the struggle against colonialism and apartheid. Every time when we play this song, it inspires us.
All right, so Peter Tosh, Fighting Apartheid, with abbreviation No Nuclear War. So that'll be the song after the outro, and then that'll be it. We'll see you next week.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. All the best.